Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about understanding why there are dietary concerns and health concerns with sugar intake, and it's not for the reasons that people seem to think it is. This always comes up, and people will say things like, well, because they're simple carbohydrates, they absorb fast, the insulin response, all of that. And that's actually not true. That's not what the data shows, and that's also a misunderstanding of the concern. We're not concerned with simple carbohydrates. And this is also a point people make who don't have a problem with refined sugars. They'll say, well, everything ends up as glucose anyways, which is a simple sugar, and even some of the fat you eat and a lot of the protein you eat ends up becoming that also. So it doesn't really matter. And that's a very, very insanely reductionist response, because the data does show there's problems. We know, based upon quite a bit of clinical research and observational data, that large amounts of refined sugar intake is harmful to health on multiple levels. So what people need to understand is the why. It's a quantitative issue of fructose. In other words, fructose is the only simple sugar that we're concerned with. Now, there's a fair amount of it in fruit, and I'm going to get into why that's not really a major concern. Table sugar is 50% fructose, 50% glucose. Now, there's our biggest source. High fructose corn syrup is the next step up at 55% fructose, 45% glucose, approximately, if I have my numbers correct. Okay, and this is where we're getting it from, and we don't even need to get into the whole thing of things like crystalline fructose. What we also need to understand is that some fructose isn't bad. In other words, we're looking at this and realizing that technically fructose itself is, for all purposes, a toxin. Okay, and people say, you can't just throw that term out there unless you can name it. Well, I can name it. It's called fructose. And the liver has to process it in a process that is very similar to ethene or ethanol, right? Which is what's in your alcohol, which is also a toxin. But just because you consume it doesn't mean it's a problem, and it doesn't mean that it reaches the liver. And this is where we have to understand the problem. All right, first of all, we're looking at how much fructose reaches the liver. And again, there are some benefits to a small amount, and I want that to be clear. We're not saying that any amount of it's bad. There's some benefits, including even possibly improved sleep, recovery from exercise, things like that, from at least some fructose reaching the liver. It's that excess intake that we're not prepared to deal with. So first of all, we need to look at what's happening in the gut, because glucose is what we want. Glucose is the preferred fuel source of the human body. It's what we burn for the majority of the things that we do. Things like the brain cannot burn anything else completely. They can burn ketones to some extent, but the brain has to have glucose or it will die very, very, very fast, extremely quickly, without any glucose. But we need to understand that, again, glucose is the preferred energy source of your body. Okay? It is our normal, healthy fuel source, and it's a simple sugar. And yes, your body tries to convert everything that it eats, if it can, into glucose through different pathways. Right? So we need to be clear there. That's not our concern. Right? It's easiest for it to convert things like starches. Right? Starches are the simplest natural form of glucose that we have. It requires minimal work on our body to get it. All right, perfectly good there. Rice, potatoes, things like that. All right. But what we're looking at is absorption. So fructose that you consume in certain forms, say fruit with fiber and stuff present, it doesn't get absorbed in the upper intestine because the fiber slows that down. It blocks absorption. It slows it down enough that as your body digests it and then passes it through your gut, the majority of that, say again, the fructose found in fruit, is going to reach the lower intestine. Okay, what happens in the lower intestine? Your gut flora, much of it has a process depending upon how healthy your gut flora is. Again, this varies from person to person. Genetics, lifestyle, history, everything else matter here. Previous diet. It can convert a great deal of that fructose through fermentation into glucose, which then absorbs just fine, no problem. There's no no issue with that. All right. However, faster absorbing ones that don't have the same amount of fiber or in a matrix of food to be broken down, such as table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, so on and so forth, those things get absorbed to a much larger extent in the large intestine, which doesn't have all of the gut biome and gut flora and healthy bacteria in there to break it down. So a much larger percentage of that is going to reach the bloodstream as fructose, as opposed to being converted to glucose in the gut. All right? So again, that's a big concern. Now that's reaching the bloodstream. And here's the other thing to consider. The human body has no trouble with the enzymes it uses to cleave glucose into what we want. Hey, we have a large amount of that. We've evolved to have that, right? Because we've been consuming it as a primary staple for millions of years. Okay, we're good there. Fructose, because we've never had historically large amounts of it reach our bloodstream, we have a limited amount of the enzyme called glucose, I believe isomerase. I believe that is the enzyme responsible for that. It cleaves the glucose and turns it, or the fructose, and turns it into glucose, so that we can then use it for fuel immediately. We have a limited amount of this enzyme. You can only convert so many grams of fructose that reaches the bloodstream per day. And again, that amount varies based upon the person, their genetics, lifestyle. Okay, so any of it, that the fructose that then reaches the bloodstream, that enzyme converts into glucose, that's right, it turns into glucose. So what's left? Anything that's left over reaches the liver. The liver, doing its job just to convert any other toxins and stuff into fuel, it'll do the same thing with alcohol. We'll convert that fructose into glucose so that we can use it for fuel, or it will store some of it as glycogen. The problem is that there are waste products of it associated with it that contribute to things like elevated triglycerides. They contribute to insulin resistance. So when that load gets too heavy, it puts a heavy load on the liver. This is also where we see things like non-alcoholic fatty liver, is due to excessive amounts of fructose reaching the liver and your liver having to process it through a similar process to what it does alcohol, which also causes fatty liver. Okay, so this causes fatty liver, causes additional visceral fat around your organs, can contribute to insulin resistance. Okay, and it's not to say that this is the primary method. A lot of insulin resistance comes from large amounts of saturated fat. So these are our two concerns, really, is saturated fat intake and the amount of fructose reaching the liver. Right, those are big deals. But they're both quantity related. There's a quantity involved. And so this is our concern with refined sugars, is the amount of fructose that reaches the liver that it has to process so that your body can utilize it, which does put a strain on the liver. It is slightly toxic to the liver, very similar to how alcohol is. So hopefully that clarifies our concerns. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.